This is Cast of Wonders, the young adult fiction podcast featuring stories of the fantastic. Welcome, episode 546. I'm Amy Brennan, editorial assistant at Cast of Wonders and host for this episode. Our story for today is 9 Goblins by T. Kingfisher, episode 3. T. Kingfisher, more usually known as Ursula Vernon, is the author of many children's books, the Hugo Award-winning comic Digger, and the Nebula Award-winning story Jackalope Wives. She writes books for adults and young adults under the name T. Kingfisher, including The Seventh Bride, The Raven and the Reindeer, and the latest, A House with Good Bones. In 2021, she won the Lodestar Award for Best Young Adult Book, the novel A Wizard's Guide to Defensive Baking. This story is narrated by Catherine Inskip, who is also the editor for Cast of Wonders. She teaches astrophysics for a living and spends her spare time populating the universe with worlds of her own. You can find more of her stories and poems at Motherboard, The Dunesteef, Lunar Station Quarterly, Abyss and Apex, and Polytechny. And now, we've a tale to tell.
Nine Goblins by T. Kingfisher. Narrated by Catherine Inskip. Part 3. All wizards are crazy. Not the quaint, colloquial crazy, where you have an offbeat sense of humour and wear brightly coloured socks. Not mild eccentricity coupled with a general lack of fashion sense. Not, you don't have to be crazy to work here, but it helps. Wizards aren't weird. They are genuinely, legitimately around the bend. This is because magic is a form of psychosis. Forget the bearded men wearing robes covered in stars trying to sell you bargain spellbooks. 9 times out of 10 it's a scam, and the 10th time they really can do magic, but it's not something they can teach. Footnote: some forms of insanity can indeed be taught. Unfortunately, magic doesn't seem to be one of them. Various parties have done intensive studies of arcane manifestation disorder, or AMD, and the results often make for interesting reading, but they still don't know what causes someone to have a sudden psychotic break and wake up able to throw fire from their fingertips. It just happens. There are basically 2 kinds of sufferers of AMD, the high-functioning and the rather less so. High-functioning wizards can live on their own, and while they tend to be shy and awkward in social situations, meticulously neat and easily startled, they're not any worse off than the rest of us. The more unfortunate wizards generally require someone to dress them and can't be allowed near any sharp objects. By its very nature, magic is highly complex and highly individualised. It's hard to say what magic can and can't do, because it varies so wildly between wizards. Some of them are battle machines, some of them are good in the garden, some of them do weather. Some of them can, on a good day, turn mushrooms into hedgehogs, and some of them can shatter mountains. There's a young woman in East Charing who can't talk, but can heal just about anything that ails you. You just don't know. Because of this unpredictability, nobody much relies on magic. People have tried, but you get a lot of very unhappy wizards, and they're not a group you want to make unhappy. While individuals with AMD often find work suited to their own particular talents, the only large institutions with a policy of employing wizards en masse are various armies. Sergeant Nasilka had been in the Goblin army since she was old enough to lie about her age, and she had encountered a fair number of enemy wizards. Footnote: the Goblin army employs wizards as well. Due to the uncomplicated nature of Goblin psychology, AMD seems to manifest as a reckless disregard for personal well-being, making the Magician's Corps the only group more feared than the Mechanics Corps, and with a higher rate of turnover. There'd been the one who shot smothering clouds of butterflies out of his fingertips, and the one who made people's skeletons shock off their bodies like someone taking off a heavy coat, and the really creepy one who'd just made people go away. This guy shot blue out of his mouth. Nasilka had never seen anybody shoot blue from their mouths, but the goblins who'd been hit weren't getting up again, and that was more than enough for her. "It's a wizard! Get the wizard!" somebody was yelling. "Follow me, quick!" After a minute of this, Nasilka realised she was the one doing the yelling and cursed her traitorous vocal cords. Of all the body parts to suddenly discover patriotism. Then her feet appeared to discover it as well, because she seemed to be charging at the wizard. "Why, feet, why now? Why can't you be more like the spleen, say? The spleen never charges anybody." Her feet ignored her. Her vocal cords appeared to have gotten the hint, because she wasn't yelling anymore, or perhaps her blood was just pounding her ears too loudly to tell. She wondered if anybody was actually following her. Not daring to look behind her for fear of finding that she was making a suicide charge all on her own, she continued forward. The ground slipped and slid and squelched under her broad feet. At this stage of the fight, footing was often more dangerous than the other guys having swords. All those feet running and jumping and tearing over the hillside had churned it into dirt and mud and slippery bits. If you fell down, you slid, until you hit somebody else. A dead body if you were lucky, a live, angry body carrying a blunt instrument if you weren't. Goblins actually have an advantage in this terrain, since their feet are so huge, but there are limits. She tripped over something. Goodness, I hope that wasn't what it looked like, and stumbled down the slope, not entirely in control of her own course. An elf appeared in front of her. He had a sword. Unable to stop, and for lack of anything better to do, she ran directly into him at full speed. He squawked and went down. So did she. Overhead, another bolt of blue shot out and dropped a nearby goblin like a rock. Sometimes, whoever gets up first wins, and since Nasilka was sitting on the elf's leg, she had a tenuous advantage. The elf kicked and bucked under her. She slammed her club down on his knee, which put a stop to that, rolled to her feet, took aim, and stomped hard. Male elves are no different from any other humanoid species in some regards. He probably wouldn't die, but he'd certainly wish he had, and Nasilka didn't have time to stick around, with the wizard still spitting bolts of blue everywhere. She slid and squelched forward. Then she got onto a patch that still had grass on it, oh glory, and got traction and pounded forward. She was 20 feet away, and it occurred to her that her entire plan was hit wizard with club and hope for the best. This was not a bad plan as such things go, but it did not seem to have a contingency for the wizard spitting blueness at her. There were footsteps behind her. Somebody yelled. The wizard looked up and his eyes went wide. Nasilka had to do it. She darted a glance behind her. The entire 19th Infantry, from Algol down to Blanchet's teddy bear, were right behind her. Shock warred with gratitude, warred with the horror that she was going to get them all killed. Nasilka left her emotions to sort the matter out on their own time, raised her club, and thundered up the last few feet to the wizard. Woo-ha! The wizard stopped shooting blue. His mouth opened again, but this time in what looked like a cry of terror, and he reached both hands to one side and grabbed at thin air. Nasilka wondered briefly if he'd gone mad with terror or was trying to milk an invisible cow. Then, and even for magic this was weird, he grabbed the air and yanked. The air tore open, really tore, as if it were a big sheet of canvas with the world painted on it, and there was something on the other side. Darkness, shot with green, that moved. Sergeant Nasilka did not know much about magic, but she was pretty sure that tearing holes in the air meant no good for anybody. She tried to stop. The 19th Infantry, led by Algol, crashed into her back. Her feet went out from under her, and she crashed into the wizard, who in turn crashed into the hole in the air. The hole went glorp. The wizard went, ah! Nasilka went, crap! Algol went, Sodge! The world went black. Sings to Trees was tired, but he felt good. This was his normal state of being, so he didn't stop to notice it. The bone doe, now with a splint and a tightly wrapped cast, had melted into the trees, followed by her brooding companion. The stag hadn't liked him messing around with the doe's leg and had rattled near constantly, like a furious rattlesnake, until the doe had turned her head and snapped her exposed teeth in the stag's direction. Sings to Trees gazed off in the middle distance with a vague, pleasant expression, the way that most people do when present at other people's minor domestic disputes, and, after a moment, the stag had stopped rattling and the doe had turned back and rested her chin trustingly on Sings to Trees' shoulder. This would have been a touching gesture, if her chin hadn't been made of painfully pointy blades of bone. It was like being snuggled by an affectionate plough. But the leg had gotten splintered and wrapped, and the doe was walking more easily on it already, and beyond that it was in the hands of whatever gods looked after the articulated skeletons of deer. He pulled on the rusted handle of the pump until water gushed out. He washed his hands, then plunged his whole head briefly under it. Refreshed and spluttering, he headed back up to the farmhouse to look something up. Sings to Trees, while not having many fragile things, did own a small library, which he kept locked in a cedar chest for safekeeping. One look at the outside of the chest. It was scorched by fire, scored by claws, chewed by teeth, and some kind of acid had etched a random design in the lid, made it obvious why something as fragile as paper was on the inside. He had several herbals, full of small, neat drawings of plants and careful notes, 2 of which he'd written himself. He had Sleestack's Guide to Common Farmyard Maladies and Diseases of the Goat. It was amazing how many of those showed up in Trolls, and The Good Elf's Almanac, which contained many, many E's and not much useful information, and the exhaustive Herbal Remedies, which was 6 inches thick and full of bookmarks. He even had a dog-eared copy of Medica Magica, which was full of outright lies and falsehoods, but every now and then had something worth paying attention to. The book he really wanted was near the bottom. Sings to Trees dug down, building up precarious stacks of leather bindings on either side of the trunk, until he found the volume and lifted it into the light. The silver leaf had long since flaked off the cover, and the letters had become a series of flat spaces in a sea of tooled leather, read as much with the hand as the eye. In the language of humans, it read bestiary. The elf sat down and began turning pages carefully. There was no index. The author had been a wizard and had been doing well to hold it together long enough to write the descriptions, which were rambling in places and painfully abrupt in others when they weren't downright insane. There were no chapters and nothing resembling alphabetical order. The entries showed up where they showed up, and given the nature of some of the comments interspersing the text, the reader was generally grateful to get that much. The pictures, though, the pictures practically moved on the page. Even in scratchy black and white, they shone like little gems. The elegant neck of the unicorn flexed. The serpentine mane of the catoblepus writhed, muscles pulsed in the shoulders of the great boar. Magic may have been involved. Sings to Trees rather thought that the author's gift had been visions, because the creatures gave every evidence of being drawn from life, and in some cases, like the kraken or the ice moles, that would have been quite a feat. He was 2/3 of the way through the book, scrutinising each illustration carefully before he saw it. The carefully articulated skeleton of a stag gazed back at him from the page. The cervidine, or cervidian, does range widely through the wold, being in all ways like unto a true deer, saving that it be made of bones and not of flesh. Why are you poking at me? Stop, I implore you. The Cervidian reproduces by manner unknown, though it is said that they may build a fawn of bones and so imbue it with essential life. The poking to cease, but I have not been witness to this, and consider it may be folly. It is known the Cervidian is much fond of magic, and very curious, like unto a magpie, and will oft be found in areas of great mystical disturbance, which perhaps it may eat, for it takes no sustenance of grass. I will become angry if there is more poking, and only damps its bones in water and dew. Why do you not stop? It went on in that vein for quite a while, and by the time the author had gotten control of himself again, he was talking about the limerick contests held by manticores. Sings to Trees closed the book thoughtfully. Of course, just because the Cervidian was attracted in magical disturbance, it didn't follow that there was one happening nearby, but it was still interesting. He hadn't seen such a creature in all the years he'd been out here. He should probably send a pigeon to the rangers and ask them if anything weird was happening. There was an almighty crash from the hearth. Sings to Trees bolted to his feet. The raccoon had learned how to open the hutch and had celebrated its newfound freedom by knocking the hutch over, along with the iron fire grate and the tea kettle that had been warming there. It sat in the midst of the wreckage, paws clasped in glee, and greeted Sings with a happy clop. The elf sighed. He had enough trouble without borrowing more. He scooped up the raccoon cub, rescued the kettle, and began putting books away before his patient got any more bright ideas. The sergeant's head hurt. Somebody was singing under their breath. Thumper again, probably. With a whack-whack here. Gods, her head hurt. She wanted to go back to sleep. Sleep was good. Sarge? Oh, Lord, they wanted her to wake up. Sarge, we have a problem. Worse and worse. They wanted her to wake up and be the sergeant. She didn't want to wake up and be the sergeant. Being the sergeant was thankless, and they didn't pay you very much more, and when something went wrong, you were the one that had to fix things. Responsibility was lousy. Footnote: they hadn't actually paid anybody for the last 4 months, so this was really a moot point, but it was the principle of the thing. Sarge! On the other hand, if you didn't see things were done right, it'd get done badly, and watching the resulting inefficiency was like being poked repeatedly in a sore tooth. It galled at her. Besides, if she didn't get up, Murray would be in charge, and he hadn't done anything bad enough to deserve that. She opened one eye. Algol was shaking her shoulder. Ugh. That didn't sound right. She paused, licked her lips, tried again. Her mouth was dry. Yes, Corporal? We have a problem, Sarge. Of course they had a problem. Everybody always had a problem. There was a war on, after all. She sat up. Where's the battle? Oh, you don't seem to be there anymore, Sarge. Don't seem to... Nasilka looked around. Most of the 19th Infantry was sprawled on the ground. Murray was on the other side of what looked like a small clearing in the woods, except they'd been on a hillside, not in the woods. Where'd the woods come from? Did these trees grow while I was asleep? Algol considered this dutifully. I think they take longer than that, Sarge. Is the battle over? Did you carry me back the way we came? Algol shook his head. I just woke up, Sarge. Murray came over, folding up a little glass and brass contraption in his hands. We're not at the battlefield. Thank you, Corporal Obvious, said Nasilka, ignoring that she had said something similar about half a minute before. No, Sarge, you don't understand. We're not anywhere near the battlefield. We're miles off. There's a break in the trees over there, and I got sighting on a mountain. I think it's Goblin Home. Well, that's fine then, said Nasilka. Goblin home? Sarge, it's at least 50 miles away. We're on the wrong side of it. She considered this. The seaside? The human side, Sarge. Sergeants don't scream. They shout at people quite a lot, but they do not scream. Nasilka took a deep breath and let it out cautiously. She didn't scream. Okay, that was fine then. So what you're saying is, we're behind enemy lines? Murray laughed. There was a slightly hysterical edge to it. Sarge, we'd have to move about 40 miles up to just be behind enemy lines. We're practically behind the enemy nation. Ah. There was a long moment, while Murray fiddled with his glass and brass thing, and Algol stared up into the trees, and Nasilka's mind was an absolute blank. She was a sergeant by virtue of always being the responsible one. She'd had the same 2 weeks of boot camp as everybody else. At no point had they covered what to do when you were accidentally whisked into the heart of enemy territory. Still, you had to do something. All right, she said finally. Murray, Algol, get everybody awake and on their feet. Check for wounded. See who came with us. They saluted and peeled off. Nasilka got to her feet and looked around. It wasn't a bad forest. Other than the fact that they absolutely weren't supposed to be there, it was a perfectly nice forest. It was deep and green, and the ground was covered in a soft mat of some little plant or other. The spots under the trees were deep with pine needles and leaf litter. Birds were calling from the canopy. The branches whispered and shifted gently in the wind. It was a nice forest. It had probably belonged to goblins once. It was a shame they couldn't stay here for a bit. She sighed. Up in the trees, a crow went "ark," and the call seemed to hang in the air for a long time. Everybody's up, Sarge, said Murray. Nobody's bad hurt, but Blanchett's got a twisted ankle. He says I can walk on it, said Blanchett, nodding to the teddy bear. Probably not a full march, though. Tell him thank you, said Nasilka absently. About 2/3 of the whining niners had come through the hole in the air with her. Algol, Murray, Blanchett, Thumper, the recruits, gods, the recruits, plus Gluber, who always had a finger in some orifice or other, and Weasel, who was tiny and slender and of completely indeterminate gender, and who stuttered when you tried to talk to, for lack of a better word, her. Nasilka was pretty sure she was a girl, but if Weasel wasn't going to say anything about it, neither was she. Everybody else was back at the battlefield. And we found the wizard too, said Algol. Oh dear. The wizard was in a lot worse shape than any of them. He was still unconscious, his breathing was shallow, and his skin was grey. This would have been normal in a goblin, but he was one of the pinkish humans, so it probably wasn't a good sign. He had a thin, worried face and badly bitten fingernails. He didn't look like a lunatic killing machine, but then who did? There didn't seem to be any marks on him, and Nasilka was pretty sure she hadn't run into him that hard. It's probably the magic, said Murray. I bet he was trying to cut and run. That thing in the air was an escape route. Maybe it takes energy to go through it, and when we all fell through it, it knocked him out. What do we do with him now? Asked the recruits meekly. The 19th all looked at each other while carefully not meeting each other's eyes, which is a pretty neat trick. Nasilka sighed. They ought to kill him. They all knew they ought to kill him. He was the enemy, and he was a wizard, and he'd probably killed a lot of goblins shooting that blue stuff out of his mouth. He'd kill them all if he had a chance. The problem was that it's one thing to kill somebody when they're charging at you with a sword or shooting blue things, but it's an entirely different thing to kill somebody who's lying unconscious on the ground. The one is just war. Wars are like that. This, though, this felt like murder. Goblins are nasty and smelly and grumpy and have bad attitudes, but they're not inherently bad. They're pretty much like anybody else. They don't kill people for fun, regardless of what the propaganda posters say. And this guy was a wizard, and wizards were scary, but you had to feel a little sorry for them too. They probably hadn't wanted to wake up one day with the power to unmake the world. Nasilka shook her head. We're not going to kill him. Everybody relaxed imperceptibly. We can't tie him up, though, Murray pointed out. When he wakes up, if he gets his hands or his mouth free, he could magic us. So we'd better be a long way off when he wakes up, said Nasilka. Everybody, get ready to move out. Thumper, cut a crutch for Blanchett. Gloober, get your finger out of there. Algol, do we have any blankets? No, Sarge, we don't have much. Nobody took their full kit into the battle. Murray's got some mechanical stuff in his pack, and I've got a rope, but beyond that, it's basically whatever we've got on our backs and our field kits. The standard issue Goblin field kit is a pocket knife, 2 bandages of dubious cleanliness, a rubber band, a stump of candle, some dried fruit, and a book of matches. It fits into the standard issue tin cup, which then fits into a small pouch. It was better than nothing, but not by much. If I cannibalise a couple of things, Murray patted his back, which caused everyone to brace briefly for an explosion. I can probably rig another travel stove. We'll be able to cook anyway. Does anybody have a bow and arrow? Nobody did. Archers were another unit entirely. The 19th was strictly hand-to-hand. Weasel put up a hand shyly. Yes, Private? Weasel turned bright red. Nasilka put an arm around the small goblin's shoulders and turned her around so that the eyes of the troop weren't on her. In your own time, Private. I can use a sling, Sarge. Good. We might actually eat after all. We're almost ready, Sarge, said Algol. Blanchett was experimenting with his crutch under the watchful eye of the teddy bear. Nasilka looked down at the wizard. No blankets. She sighed. She was going to miss it tonight, but she pulled her cloak off and laid it over the wizard. Poor sod was probably in shock, and if he didn't stay warm, it was as good as having killed him. Besides, he was a wizard, and they had a hard time fending for themselves. Algol, see if you can get a little water into him before we go. I'd rather not leave a trail of dead bodies behind us. Algol nodded. Everybody else, I want to get at least 5 miles away from here, and then we're looking for a place to hole up for a bit that's hidden and defensible. Let's try not to leave a trail like a wounded moose, okay? It was a beautiful day in the forest. The birds were calling. The birds were calling a lot. Nasilka was getting a feeling that whatever they were calling was probably the ornithological equivalent of, come and get a load of this. Travelling through thick woods with a troop of goblins is not unlike a nature hike with a group of grumpy toddlers with weapons. They fell into things. They fell out of things. They attacked bushes. The bushes frequently attacked back. They startled small animals who startled them badly in return, causing them to fall over into more bushes. They stepped on things that were not good to step on, and stepped in things that squelched or stank or exploded with spores. Sergeant Nasilka watched as her troop discovered a patch of poison oak and had to look away. Blanchett, stumping up beside her, leaned on his crutch and eyed the rest of the troop. He says that's poison oak they're rolling in, he informed her, pointing to the teddy bear. I think he's right. Murray emerged from the thicket, holding a sprig of leaves at arm's length. Leaves of 3, Murray was muttering. Leaves of 3. Gods, everything has 3 leaves. How do you tell? If you touch me with that, Corporal, I'll have you court-martialed. Yes, Sarge. They rounded up the now itchy troop and staggered on. How far do you think we've come, Murray? Maybe a mile, Sarge? Probably not much more than that. We lost some time when Gloober stepped on the wasp nest. A tree had apparently offended Thumper in some fashion. He attacked it with his maces, and then with his teeth. Algol, go rescue that tree? Gloober, if you've got poison ivy on that finger, you're going to regret sticking it in there. Weasel, whoa! Weasel turned scarlet and mumbled something. Is that a pheasant? I made a sling, Sarge. She held out a strip that, in a former life, had been a section of rancid goat-hide loincloth. Slung over her shoulder was a very large, very dead bird, nearly as big as the little goblin's torso, and sporting a gorgeous rainbow of feathers. I thought, Weasel, remind me to put in for a medal for you when we get home. Bird tonight! Can you catch another one? The little goblin mumbled and shrugged and stared at her toes. Do your best. Make someone else carry the bird. Sarge, there's a break in the trees up ahead. Murray was already digging in his backpack. Permission to go scout the land? Permission granted? What do you call that contraption anyway? What, the looky tube thing? Yeah, the looky tube thing. Ask a stupid question? Yeah, go get the lay of the land. Everybody, take 5. Gloober, I warned you about that finger. Murray returned in about 10 minutes, frowning. Algol supervised the application of mud to scrapes, stings and welts. Nasilka was mentally composing a report to the Goblin High Command, detailing the need for wilderness survival training for the troops. Heading 1, Poison Oak, identification of. What's the good word, Murray? Murray chewed on his lower lip. Not much of a good word. We're on the west side of a pretty substantial forest. It runs a fair way, and it curves around to the north, so if we follow the edge, we'll get closer to Goblin Home, but not very fast. What about striking out from the forest? Don't recommend it, Sarge. It's all farmland out there between us and home. Absolutely flat for a long way, practically right up to the foothills. At least 30 miles of farm, 20 more of hills. You or I could make it in a couple of days, but with this crew... He spread his hands in an eloquent gesture that expressed, rather better than words, the general competence of the Wine and Niners at anything resembling stealth. Better part of a week in the open, with cornfields and hedgerows for cover. You know I'll follow you anywhere, Sarge, but I think it's suicide. Heading 2, moving stealthily, practice thereof. And if we follow the forest? Probably closer to 50 or 60 miles, although it's hard to tell. Could be more. We'll still have an open bit at the end. Can't tell if the woods go up to the foothills, but I don't think they do. But we'd be under cover most of the way. Nasilka nodded. She had a brief vision of herding the 19th across open fields by night, hiding in drainage ditches during the day, barking dogs, men with crossbows, and shuddered. I'm thinking we'll go with your plan. One more thing. There's a town, probably 10 miles north, real close to the woods. We can probably go deeper in and go around it and risk getting lost, but we might want to try raiding it. Raiding? Corporal, there are 9 of us. 9 goblins could, on a good day, probably disrupt a child's tea party or decimate a chicken coop, but Nasilka wouldn't have put them against anything bigger. I'm not suggesting we try to pillage the town, Sarge. I had more in mind hitting a hen house and maybe somebody's laundry. Have you seen Thumper's loincloth? Thank you, I've been trying not to look. There's a couple of isolated farmhouses on the outskirts. I think a small group could raid one. I've got no stomach for killing farmers, Murray, and if we do, we're going to have hunters after us before you can say Glarguk. Footnote. Glarguk is a paste made of dried figs and beetle scrapings, popular as a sandwich spread among goblin school children. Great gods, no, Sarge, I'm hoping they won't even see us. She relented. OK, talk to me again when we've found a place to hole up for a bit. I'm still hoping to put miles between us and that wizard. In the end, they found a kind of dirt cave in a mostly dried-out riverbed. If it rained, they might flood out, but the promise of even a muddy pool of water nearby was more than enough to recommend the campsite. They had made at least 3 miles, which wasn't as much as Nasilka liked, but it was better than nothing. Weasel had managed to bring down a rabbit. A rabbit and a bird weren't much between 9 people, but along with the dried field rations it wasn't bad, and everybody knew it could have been a lot worse. Both rabbit and pheasant were cooked on a spit and were greeted with so many appreciative complaints. "Ah, tough as an old shoe! You call this rabbit? Looks like a long-eared ferret. Tastes like one too. What was this bird eating? Stink bugs?" But the little goblin was completely tongue-tied. "OK, guys, tomorrow we're doing a full day's march," said Nasilka, once the last bones had been gnawed. Groans greeted this. She waved them off. "We've got a route back to Goblin Home, but we're sticking to the woods for now." "How far are we from Goblin Home, Sarge?" "About 50 miles as the crow flies. We're not crows, though, so we're looking at 70 or 80. More groans. "Why can't we take the short way?" "'Cause it's through human farmland, and I don't think they'll be real happy to see us." "Perhaps we could go in disguise?" asked Gluber hopefully. "We're 4 feet tall and green. I think they're going to notice." Blanchett consulted with his teddy bear for a few minutes and then said, "He says it's a good plan, Sarge." The teddy bear had one of the pheasant tail feathers stuck behind one ear, giving it a jaunty look. Thank him for me." Nasilka wondered briefly what she'd have done if the teddy bear hadn't approved, had a brief vision of a mutiny led by a one-eyed stuffed animal, and squelched it. It had been a long enough day already. It was a long night, too. Goblins are good at sleeping on the ground. They had all been doing it for so long that they hardly cared anymore. Pack for a pillow, cloak if they had one, and tonight they had the luxury of cut pine boughs for a mattress, which was significantly better than camping on the hillside. No one was complaining there. No, the problem was the noises. Generally, the noises of goblin digestion, snoring, and other indelicate processes were enough to drown out anything outside. This time, however, the gurgle of 9 stomachs had nothing on the woods. "Those aren't normal," said Thumper the 4th or 5th time something went by with a swoosh outside, as if on enormous wings. "It's owls," said Murray. "It's not owls," said Thumper. "I'm a forest goblin, Kay. Those aren't owls." "You can't have been in the forest since you were little," said Murray. "They haven't changed owls since I was a kid. Owls are silent, like. They sneak up on stuff. That's not an owl." As if exhausted by speaking this many words all at once, he fell silent. Everybody listened. Something that probably wasn't an owl whooshed by again. "We don't like this, Sarge," said Mishkin and Mushkin. "Sarge doesn't like it either," said Nasilka. "But it's out there, and we're in here, and it'll have to come through me to get to you, so go to sleep." She was closest to the entrance of the cave, and she'd always had pretty good hearing. She was probably the only one who could hear the other noise, the soft, sucking sound of footsteps in mud, as something walked quietly up the riverbed 15 or 20 feet away. Thwack, thwack, swoosh. She glanced behind her. Murray was the next closest, but he was half deaf from his time in the Mechanics Corps and the daily explosions. She didn't say anything. Her hand tight on the handle of the club, Sergeant Nasilka stared, wide-eyed, into the dark.
I have been a fan of Ursula's since her LiveJournal days, when she was more of an artist than a writer, and when she posted small vignettes of stories, and when The Wizard's Guide to Defensive Baking was born and became the unsellable Bread Wizard story. Oh, how wrong were all those publishers that turned Ursula down. Through it all, Ursula's characters have had one thing that really pulls me to them, quite apart from being quirky in a good way. they make sense. I mean, why shouldn't magic be a mental health condition? I have autism spectrum disorder and depression myself, and you should see the cinematic nature of my dreams. I keep a diary because there's so many that are so vivid. Translate that into the real world and things would get weird, and actually quite a lot of fun, very fast. Other thing Ursula is great at is making those beings that are normally vilified as vermin, or dirty, or just plain evil, normal and relatable. They aren't that different from us, in fact. They may look different, they may have different culture and languages, but it's how one treats those who are, like this wizard, unconscious or down that marks a person or being good or evil. And even then, there's a spectrum based on cultural norms. But one thing these goblins won't do, go to war and kill though they might, they won't do a murder of a being that's completely vulnerable. And that's one of the things I love about Ursula's writing. She makes heroes out of the most unlikely characters, and she makes it believable. Join us again soon. We love bringing you the best audio fiction week after week, but we can't do it without your support. Your donations pay our authors, honorators, our servers and our staff. Please consider supporting us with a monthly donation through either PayPal or Patreon. You can also review us on Apple Podcasts, request us on Spotify, and consider the stories we publish for award consideration. There are lots of ways you can help. Join the discussion on the EA forum, forum.escapeartists.net, or EA Discord. Visit our Twitter @Cast of Wonders. Come say hello. Cast of Wonders is brought to you by editor Catherine Inskip, assistant editor Alicia Casparasso, associate editors Tanya Adelot, Amy Brennan, Joyce Hernandez, Somto Eswe, Cup Your Hob, Amanda Kong, Ray O, Simon Pan, Samuel Poots, Emma Smales, Denise Sudell, and Rin Yi. Our editorial assistant is Amy Brennan. Our community manager is Denise Sudell, and our audio producer is Jeremy Carter. Cast of Wonders is part of the Escape Artists Foundation, a 501c3 non-profit, and this episode is distributed under the Creative Commons Non-Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives 4.0 International License. That means you can download or listen to the episode on any device you like, but you can't change it or sell it. Our theme music is Appeal to Heavens by Alexei Nov, available from Promo DJ or his Facebook page. Thanks for listening.